Greetings friends, RevDMQ here. Hope everybody is doing all right. I've got a quick little video for you about the World War II maps and theaters and battles that we need to see in Battlefield 5. And I wanted to make this video because, a little backstory before I jump into the top 5 choices I have. I started playing Battlefield 1942 in 2002 when I was 14 years old and was just blown away by the history that they had included in that Battlefield title. And Battlefield actually got me interested in World War II history. I started doing my own research outside of the video game to learn about the levels that I was playing, about the environments I was in. And that led to a rich love of history, so much so that when I entered my undergraduate degree, I pursued a degree in history. So one of my majors from college is history, and I attribute that in large part to Battlefield 1942, to teaching me through the medium of video games about what happened in World War II that sparked something in me, that ignited something in me, that led to a life thrilled by history. So while World War II was not my first choice for Battlefield 5, I'm very excited to see them revisit this title. I'm excited to see them revisit this era. And I think they can do some pretty spectacular things. I'm excited about what they're doing with war stories and these untold stories of World War II. So here are my top 5 choices for the maps we should see in Battlefield 5. The first battle that I think needs to find its way into Battlefield 5 in these war stories and in the multiplayer is from the Eastern Front. Now, when we think of the Eastern Front, we think of the Battle of Stalingrad, we think of the Battle of Moscow, but very, very early on in the war was the Battle of Brody. And this was early in Hitler's Blitzkrieg. This was kind of the height of the Blitzkrieg campaign headed east from Germany, and this is still considered one of the most large-scale tank battles in history. Some scholars say that this is the largest tank battle of World War II of all. There were 750 tanks used by the Germans. There were 3,500 tanks used by the Soviet Union. But it was more than just an armored battle. This was also a battle in the air. Germany was able, despite the surpassing numbers of the Soviet Union, to defeat the Red Army, in large part due to the air superiority that they had over the Red Army at the time. And so this was a battle that was of great strategic importance as Germany was heading east, breaking down the Red Army early in the war. It led to a lot of casualties for the Soviet Union. And so I think this would be an important battle to see in Battlefield 5, because it's one of the lesser-known battles of World War II. I think it'd be important to see something on the Eastern Front. We very often think of Middle Europe when we think of World War II, so I think looking to the east would be very important, the eastern side of Europe, to see kind of how Germany was able to inflict such heavy casualties on the Soviet Union and to be able to incorporate the Blitzkrieg into this title. So the first thing I think would be great would be the Battle of Brody. The next battle, chronologically, that I think we should see in Battlefield 5, this one is not one of the lesser-known ones, but it was an incredibly important campaign, which I could see being used as perhaps a grand operation, and that's the Guadalcanal campaign. The Guadalcanal campaign happened between August 1942 and February 1943, and it was the first Allied attack in the Pacific. It was incredibly important because Guadalcanal is located just northeast of Australia. It was held by Japan at the time, and Japan was surprised by the Allied offensive, and the Allies wanted it. The United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, they wanted Guadalcanal because that would be an important passageway, both west and north. So I'll talk a little bit later on in this video about the Chinese involvement in World War II. But in order for the United States to support China, they needed to be able to move farther west all the way through the Pacific. And so Guadalcanal served as an opportunity for the Allies to take some territory very, very far west in the Pacific theater. It would make for a nice grand operations map because it took place on Guadalcanal and on the British Solomon Islands, and it opened the door to some very strategic operations in the future, the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific, which would eventually lead to the surrender of Japan. So Guadalcanal and the Allied victory there was incredibly important. And I think it would be great because we could see some of that beginning jungle warfare, that amphibious warfare. We can have the beach landings and the air, land, and sea fighting all on Guadalcanal. And there's a real opportunity to tell some incredible stories through Guadalcanal. So the second map that I'd like to see is Guadalcanal. Number 3 on my top 5 maps for Battlefield 5 is another very important strategic battle. It's a larger operation, which again could work as a grand operation in Battlefield 5, and that's Operation Torch. Operation Torch was an important landing in North Africa and in Northwest Africa. At the time, the Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the European theater. France had been taken out. Britain was limping behind. And so Russia really wanted America and Canada and the United Kingdom and the Netherlands and Australia. They wanted them to open up a second theater in Western Europe. But at the time, the British generals believed that it would be more advantageous to go south to try to take care of French North Africa first. And so there were landings all across Northwest Africa in French-held Africa. And this is particularly interesting to me because when you look at the two sides that were fighting, and on the Allies side, you've got the United States, you've got the United Kingdom, India, and then Free France, as well as Canada, Netherlands, and Australia. But then on the Axis side, you've got Germany, Italy, Algeria, Morocco, and then you've also got Vichy France. So this could be a really interesting story to tell because you've got the French fighting on both sides of Operation Torch, which is very interesting and something we don't generally see in a video game like this. But it was of strategic importance because being able to control North Africa allowed the Allies to then enter Europe through Italy. You guys remember Battlefield 1942 Road to Rome, right? Does that strike a bell for anybody? And so Operation Torch was very, very important, and I think it could be really fun once again to see some of the Middle Eastern, some of the North African desert maps, maybe tone down some of the sandstorm stuff we saw in Battlefield 1. But most of the time when we think of a desert map, we think of something like Sinai or Suez, which is just all sand and little villages. But Operation Torch provides an opportunity for amphibious desert maps, which is really unique and really interesting. And I think if Battlefield wanted to incorporate Operation Torch, they could tell some fun stories. They could tell some important stories that would change the course of the war. So number 3 for me is Operation Torch. The fourth location that I think would be really interesting to see in Battlefield 5 changes things up a little bit. We really don't think of this, at least as Americans or Europeans, we don't think of this location as being central to victory in World War II, but it really was. And that is the Siege of Makena. Now, this is not something we think of. This took place in Burma, Western China. And when we think of the Allies in Japan, we think of Pacific, right? But something we often forget is that China, by most records, had the second most casualties in the war, second only to the Soviet Union. So I think it would only be fair that we can see a fight in China between the Chinese and the United States and Japan, because truth is, without China's involvement, the Allies would not have been able to win the war against Japan. The Japanese Empire was huge, and this battle, the Battle of Makena, was thousands of miles away from Japan on the western side of China. And as I said before, the Battle of Guadalcanal opened the passageway for the Allies, for America, to move west into Burma, into Western China. And so the Siege of Makena is important because it was an attempt to take a strategic airfield in Western China. It was between China, the United States, and Japan, and the Allied forces won. They took over that airfield. But what's interesting about this, besides the fact that it incorporates Chinese soldiers into into a title that has all but forgotten them, is that in the battle, there was confusion between some of the Chinese forces, so much so that they ended up firing upon themselves, not once, but twice in the battle. Despite this, however, because of the overwhelming forces of China and America, they took over that airfield despite Japan's attempt to blow it up, to burn it to the ground. But because China and the United States were able to take this airfield back, it opened the Lido Road connecting the Burma Road with China. This was a battle of strategic importance. Now, I think this would be really interesting because the topography of Burma would be very different than the desert or the Pacific theater or the European theaters that we've seen in other Battlefield titles. So I think the Siege of Makena could be unique to not just Battlefield, but to the video game world in general. So, number 4, I'd like to see the Siege of Makena. All right, the last battle that I think we should see in Battlefield 5, the last map that we should see in Battlefield 5 is the Battle of Luzon. This was one of the last battles of the war. It was a Pacific battle, and it was in the Philippines. This was the United States, Australia, the Philippines, and Mexico fighting against Japan and the Philippines. Once again, we've got one nation fighting on both sides of the war here. The Philippines had been split. Some were fighting with the Allies, some were fighting with the Japanese. While being late in the war, from January to August 1945, the casualty amount here in this battle was astronomical. There were up to 200,000 Japanese combatants dead. Up to 200,000. That's remarkable to me. And 120 or so Filipino civilians and soldiers killed in this fight. So this was a bloody war for the Battle of Luzon. But it would be very important if the United States was going to launch an attack on Japan. If the United States was going to have an amphibious assault against the islands of Japan, they needed to be able to take Luzon. This battle was codenamed S-Day and was an amphibious assault on this Filipino island. Part of what made Luzon so interesting was that this was one of the places where Japanese soldiers did not know that the war had ended for a long time, for years. And so after the war ended, there were these random skirmishes that would happen. So there's an interesting story to tell there. I mean, how cool would it be to see in Battlefield 5 this post-World War II battle between these unsuspecting folk and these Japanese soldiers who have been holding out, unaware that the war has ended. So I think we need to see more diverse peoples in the game, not just with Makena, but here with the Battle of Luzon, to see the Filipino soldiers standing alongside the American soldiers, fighting against the Japanese soldiers standing alongside the Filipino soldiers. So this is my final choice, the Battle of Luzon. Friends, those are my 5 choices for the maps that I'd like to see find their way into Battlefield 5. They're unique. They tell very different stories from all over the world, and I think would help make Battlefield 5 an incredibly dynamic game and an incredibly diverse game. So I want to know what you think. Do you think that these are important battles that we should see in the map? Leave a comment below if there are other ones that you think would be very interesting. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, give it a thumbs down. Make sure to turn on that notification. And if you want, share this video on Twitter and on Facebook. That would really help the channel out. Thank you, friends. I will catch you in the next video. Grace and peace.